Uh, Good morning, everybody. We are moving ahead with our last chapter for the semester, Western Civilization 1, right? And we'll be doing the Journeys of Discovery. Well, they used to be called Journeys of Discovery, but then they figure out that it's somehow politically incorrect to say that. So they call it now New Encounters. Uh, so, chapter 14, Europe and the World, New Encounters. And let's get going, and I'll explain what I can. Okay, we have chapter outline: on the brink of a new world. New horizon, Portuguese and Spanish empires, new rivals on the world stage, the impact of European expansion and toward world economy. Oh, there is one thing missing here, and that's probably the most important: the role of Spain. In other words, Spain was the first world power in the modern sense of the world. Other countries came to dominate the world: France, Great Britain, and finally the United States. But Spain was the first one to do so. So, anyways, I'll be adding some things about Spain. So, on the brink of the New World, focus question: why did Europeans begin to embark on voyages of discovery and expansion at the end of the 15th century? And then, of course, it gives you the motives for expansion. Intrigue, fantasy literature about other worlds, economics and the drive for trade, religious zeal. Anyways, I don't know what to say about these intrigue. People are always intrigued about unknown things. I don't know what was special in this time period. Economics and drive for trade. That's the one. And religious zeal. I don't see any, but that might be me. The main point is here economics and the drive for trade. In other words, and again, the book is not going to talk about it because it's important. Anyways, Ottoman Empire that we talked about last time around. It had enormous influence on the journeys of exploration. It was the empire that met the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean and tried to prevent them from reaching India. So, Ottoman Empire stretched throughout the Near East, from Algiers in Western Africa, all the way to Turkey, including Baghdad and to the borders of Iran, at that time was called Persia. And it was expanding in the 1500s all the way to the gates of Vienna. It was a mortal danger to Europe, and it controlled all the European sources of spices and other exotic things like silk that the Europeans were importing from China for some time. So Ottoman Empire was in a conflict. We talked about last time about that Battle of Lepanto, which actually saved the Western Europe from Ottoman invasion. And that blockage that Europeans faced with the Ottoman Empire was something that they tried to overcome. And how to overcome it? Well, if you want pepper, for example, and pepper grows in India, you might, and you can't get to India because the Ottoman Empire is preventing you from doing so. Ottoman merchants were more than willing to sell you Indian pepper, but at much higher prices. And therefore, you wanted to find the direct route to the pepper, to the sources of pepper in India and Ceylon, Sri Lanka, the island to the south of India where it grows naturally. And therefore, you tried to find a way around it. And they did so. So anyways, we have here about the means for exploration. So that's why, I obviously intrigue and fantasy literature and religious zeal. I don't see any of these things. I mean, people were very religious at this time period. There's probably more religious than today, but I don't see any particular religious zeal being present at the time. Or that somehow religiously zealot people were willing to go on a journey to find America, more than those who were not so religious. Anyways, it was the economy, as they say. And then we have the means of expansion, increased authority and resources of European monarchies. We talked about the growth of European monarchies, and this is what they used power for. Wealth and technology of European states, in particular, something that we don't think of great technological advancement, horses, is something that Spain did extremely well, and it helped the Spaniards to conquer the New World. In addition to rifles, guns, cannons, and sailing vessels and things of that sort. So anyways, and finally it says the impact of the Ptolemies world map. Anyways, you will find me disagreeing with this author in this chapter a lot. I tried to hold myself back, but in this case I can't. Ptolemy world map. It seems to me that they're peddling here the old idea that before the journeys of discovery, before Columbus, to make it short, people didn't know much about the world. Again, that's not true. Ptolemy was an ancient Greek geographer. We had him before in our IDs, and it popped up in our lectures here when we were talking about ancient Greece and the Hellenistic period after Alexander the Great. And it's not true that those people didn't know that the earth was round. They did. But they only knew 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. America and Australia, they didn't know. So they basically thought that, from Spain, which was the westernmost country of Europe, if you sail west, you'll probably come back on the other side. Nobody ever tried to do so. Why not? Were they stupid? No, because they were not stupid. They were just... it takes by a sailing ship about 2 months to cross the Atlantic. And then Pacific is probably 3 times as big as the Atlantic. Who goes on the journey of a year-long journey to reach the other part of the world? What kind of, support system you need to have, mechanisms that will, feed you for a whole year, a crew of, 200 people in very close quarters. it just isn't done. It wasn't done up until recently. So, anyways, and somehow this Ptolemy map of the world that kind of appeared out of nothing, it's an exaggerated story. What happened was that the Ottoman Empire, again, we're coming back to the Ottoman Empire. It makes me wonder why Mr. Spielvogel avoids talking about the Ottoman Empire in this crucial moment. Maybe because it was a Muslim empire. I don't know. I can only guess. Anyways, was getting into the Greek territory. The Greeks, finally in 1453, they conquer Constantinople. And Greeks then run to the west and bring a lot of manuscripts to the west. They did that before. That's how the Ptolemy's map came to the west, through Greek manuscripts of Byzantium. Byzantium is the old Greek city that was later called Constantinople. It was just renamed. This was the old name of the old Greek city of Byzantium. And they knew about the map. They knew the whole thing, and then. Anyways, so how detailed was this map? How, in other words, how detailed knowledge did they have about the world in general? Not very detailed. It wasn't Google Map. But, it served their purposes. For the most part, for, thousands of years, people were navigating the seas. And in general, people try to avoid going into an open sea. Why? Because you don't know where you are. you don't have a GPS or anything of that sort. So my cat is here trying to tell us something. Yes, she agrees with me. Anyways, just kidding. So, for example, I'll give you an example of Columbus, who actually he was an Italian origin, right? He was born in Genoa, and started searching for patronage by Spanish king Isabel of Castilla and Fernando of Aragon, and he told them about his idea that if you sail west, you'll eventually come to India, all the way around the globe. So obviously, even the king and queen, they might have been maleducados, as they say in Spain, badly educated, but they knew that the world was round. And the queen told him, okay, go to the University of Salamanca in Spain, and their professors of the university will examine you. And they examined his idea, and apparently there were calculations. Columbus made calculations how long it's going to take it, and the calculations are based on the size of the globe, size of the sphere that was the Earth. That is the Earth. How long it will take it? So many miles, and so on and so forth. It seems that we'll never know this one, whether on purpose or by mistake. Columbus underestimated the size of the Earth, and therefore thought that you can reach India in a shorter period of time. And he was challenged by the professors of the University of Salamanca, one of the great Spanish universities from the Middle Ages till today. And they told him, no, the size of the Earth is bigger, and it will take, this much longer to get to India. People knew about India, China, since Marco Polo, when Venetian explorer Marco Polo went on foot, well, actually not on foot, but on a horse, right? All the way through Asia and finally reached India. So the Europeans knew about India. They had an idea also. There was, Japan, an island off the coast of India. That's, as much as they knew about. Alexander the Great went to India, and so on and so forth. They didn't know about Indonesia, Philippines, and Australia, places of that sort. Anyways, so they corrected Columbus and said, no, your calculations are wrong. But then kind of Queen decided, well, he might be right. So she gave him 3 little ships. It's kind of hard to imagine. If I've seen a replica of it, and I don't know, I wouldn't cross a river in those 3 ships, but he had a crew of several hundred people there on Santa Maria Pinta and Niña. Anyways, let's move on. So that was a story about Columbus. But I'm moving to slide number 5, focus question. How did Portugal and Spain acquire their overseas empire, and how did their emperors differ? Okay, well, development of the Portuguese are really important here because the Portuguese are the first to start journeys of exploration, and by journeys of exploration I mean they're traveling south from Portuguese mainland and exploring the coast of Africa. They're building a network of Portuguese military bases from West Africa, from Morocco, all the way down to what is South Africa. It was Bartolomé Diaz who actually reached Good Hope, right? The southern tip of Africa, which is extremely difficult to sail of because of the ocean currents. They kind of push you in a direction where you don't want to go. Bartolomé Diaz was the one who reached the coast of Africa, but more importantly, what they established was a series of ports in which they started to trade with the people of the interior in Africa, and they could actually resupply their ships. So for the Portuguese, then it was easy and very soon they'll do it. They were easy to cross from Africa into Brazil. That's the shortest route across the Atlantic Ocean. From, Dakar in West Africa to Brazil. And it used to be that, I don't remember, but I read in history that, for example, in World War II, the planes could not cross the Atlantic. It was too far away. So they had to go down from, for example, New York, down to Brazil. From Brazil, they would cross into Dakar in Africa, and then from Africa, they will go into Europe. So in case you needed to go, you couldn't go across the Atlantic. It was risky. Obviously some people did it, right? But it wasn't available to any, typical plane of that time. So anyways, that's about Portugal building. Plus Portugal already actually had a couple of islands and captured a couple of islands of the coast of Portugal and then the coast of Africa. There are some islands in the middle of the Atlantic, not very many, but there are some islands, especially off the coast of Africa, that was very useful for the Portuguese. Portuguese has the Azores, and the Spaniards had the Canary Islands. Anyways, and then we have Spanish patronage, obviously Christopher Columbus. The reason why Queen Isabel of Castilla patronized Columbus was that they felt that they were lagging behind Portugal in these discoveries. So okay, he has a new idea. Let him try, and if he doesn't return, we just lost 3 small ships. No big deal. Anyways, we have chapter 6, Spanish Empire in the New World, Conquistadores. Motivated by a blend of glory, greed, and religious zeal. Why I see the desire for glory, I see their greed. I don't really see their religious zeal. The religious zeal actually comes from Queen Isabel. She's known in history as La Católica, the Catholic Queen. And she was a very devout woman. She was asked, what do we do with these people in the New World? And her answer was very simple. She said, well, if they convert to Catholicism, then they should be treated like any other subject of the Spanish Empire, like what we would call today a Spanish citizen. This, of course, didn't always work in practice, and there were a lot of misuses and abuses on the way, but that was a decision that the Queen made, I guess out of religious zeal, you can say. And she stuck to it. And this was still the case, for example, when there was slavery in the United States. Slaves in the South would run from Georgia, I don't know, to Spanish-held Florida, where there'll be no slaves any longer, because officially there was no slavery in the Spanish Empire as long as you converted to Catholicism. Anyways, which I thought it's a good deal. But anyways, Maya, the civilizations of Mesoamerica, so there were people, obviously, in America. Maya is Yucatan Peninsula. That's where a lot of people go for spring break, so I'll just skip them, because their civilization was gone and past. But Aztec were the rulers of what is today Ciudad de Mexico, or the Mexico City. Tenochtitlan, it was called the Aztec, and there are huge Aztec ruins in Mexico City, that is. And it was a empire run by the Aztec nation, and there were subordinated nations around it, and they didn't like the Aztec. They were, quite frankly, they were abused pretty badly by the Aztec, including the human sacrifice that the Aztecs sort of liked. But people that they sacrificed were not the Aztec people, they were the people that they conquered. So when Hernan Cortés showed up, Hernan Cortés was a Spanish governor of Cuba who with a couple of hundred conquistadores, warriors and horses, landed near Veracruz in Mexico, and from there went on a journey from the sea all the way to Mexico, the capital of the Aztec Empire, what is today Mexico City. City on the lake. It was an island there, and there was an island in the middle of the lake where the city was. So it was ideally protected for defense. And Cortés came in there and with amazing efficiency managed, with the help of the tribes who were not fond of the Aztec, to conquer that territory. Inca and the Spanish Inca are actually a similar civilization like the Aztec. It was a similar civilization in Peru, what is today Peru. And that part of the Americas was conquered by a Spanish conquistador, Francisco Pizarro. So, anyways, enough about that. There are other opportunities to talk about it. One of the biggest problems was exchange of germs. That has to do with the land mass of Eurasia. Basically, Eurasian people like Columbus, had a better immunity because they were exposed to a greater variety of diseases than the people of the Americas, who were actually, because of the geography of the Americas, they were less. Their immunity was not so developed. So when the Europeans came over, they brought with them germs, and you're seeing how it works. In particular, Caribbean islands were soon empty, and there were no population died of various European diseases, in particular pox. So smallpox, measles, and similar. To such an extent, actually, that slave trade started to repopulate those Caribbean islands. And Portuguese were the ones who actually started this slave trade. All right. Also, there is this encomienda system, which is something that we talked about before. It was a system of European feudalism, where subordinate people were supposed to serve the superior people in charge, and therefore they were required to work on their land. And that is the encomienda system, just a copy of the European feudalism into the New World, at the time when European feudalism was actually declining. Anyways, camera is showing me something and I wonder what it is. But we're not going to stop unless we're forced to. So anyways, viceroys means that Spain divided America in several viceroyalties, that is, the deputy kings. So what we would call governors, but the Spanish system was that there was a delegate of a king sent over, and it was ruled as a part of Spain. That was the ideal, that was the desire of the Spanish monarchs. It was not always possible. Local people, as I said before, Spain was 2 months sailing across the Atlantic, and even in the best of circumstances, a chunk of people died on these ships during a normal crossing. So they didn't have much control over what was going on in the Americas. Slide number 8, we have a couple of dates over here. Bartolomé Diaz sails around the tip of Africa in 1488. Voyages of Columbus, several voyages, 1492 to 1502. Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. It was Spain and Portugal decided to divide Americas, and in particular, what the division was that Brazil was going to go to Portugal, which is Brazil is the eastern part, the easternmost part of the American continent, and the western parts are going to go to Spain. So that's why Brazil today is still talking Portuguese, and places like Bolivia or Peru or Colombia are actually talking Spanish. So that's the Treaty of Tordesillas. Vasco da Gama was, in 1492, was the first European to reach India, going around the Horn of Africa. And actually, as I said before, the Ottomans who controlled this Arabian Peninsula at that time and had their navy in Ethiopia and in the Horn of Africa. They tried to stop the Portuguese from reaching India for business reasons, obviously. Portuguese were trying to reach the Spice Islands and get better prices. So, anyways, Portuguese ships land in southern China. Still, there is a Portuguese. I don't know if it still belonged to Portugal, but there is a Portuguese colony of Macau to the south of Hong Kong. And that's what Portuguese did in general. They would build a small city of their own and trade with the rest of the continent, but they wouldn't really go inside and try to conquer much in these cases. And finally, Magellan traveled around the world, and that was, the first one who managed to do it. Spanish conquest of Mexico from 1519 to 1522, and Pizarro's conquest of the Peru of Inca 1530 to 1535. That's about it. We have a picture of Columbus on the slide number 9, and a bit of problems that the native people in the Americas experienced from smallpox. Smallpox was a devastating disease, and but it developed what is called herd immunity, right? That's a term that is used often now with regard to the Wuhan virus. So, anyways, a couple of pictures about Native Americans afflicted with smallpox, and you have a map here of various journeys by the Portuguese, by the Spanish. They slipped in a journey by the English, when the English actually reached Newfoundland. Newfoundland, that's why it's called Newfoundland, right? In eastern Canada. Anyways, the map is pretty self-explanatory, so I don't have much to add here. You have the land of the Maya, the Yucatan Peninsula, the Spring Break territory, and finally the Aztec lands of Tenochtitlan and the Gulf of Mexico, and they didn't really mark here where Veracruz was, where Cortes landed, and finally the land of the Incas in the south, today largely in Peru. Anyways, slide number 5, we have how did the arrival of the Dutch, British, and the French on the world scene in the 17th and 18th century affected Africa, India, Southeast Asia, China, and Japan. A lot of questions over here, but one of the things to remember is it was first the Portuguese and the Spanish, and they created large empires in the Americas. Portuguese in Brazil, and Spanish in Mexico and Peru and Argentina eventually. And other European powers were latecomers to this game. So they were rivals. They were rivals of the Spanish. And they tried to get the piece of the profit that the Spanish and the Portuguese were making. So therefore, they resorted to piracy. It was a state-organized piracy by the Dutch, by the British, and the French to rob the Portuguese and the Spanish from robbing the Native Americans. Irony, isn't it? So that's what he's talking about. There's two waves of conquest. First the Spanish and the Portuguese, and then the Dutch, British, and the French. So that's the most important thing. Otherwise, this question is pretty vague and too broad. Anyways, slide number 16, slave trade. I mentioned the slave trade, and it was Portuguese who actually first specialized. The Spaniards didn't do it, although occasionally they would buy slaves from the Portuguese, but they didn't do it on their own. And it was the Dutch, Portuguese and the Dutch, who were the greatest slave merchants. Most important, this triangular trade, it involved 3 steps, right? There are kind of 2 ways to explain it, but 3 steps, okay. So the first, slaves were captured in the interior of Africa by rival African tribes. And then this was a custom of war from the time immemorial, that those people who are defeated in war become slaves. So then those defeated people were sent to the Portuguese in the coastal ports. And of course, Portuguese would put them on a ship, take them across the Atlantic into Brazil, for example, and sell them over there, and then they will be taken to the third leg of journey to work the land. That was the biggest problem of the medieval society. Who is going to work the land? Very often there were not enough people to work on it. And what particularly it came to be very profitable was sugar, which the Spanish and the Portuguese actually learned from the Muslims across the Mediterranean. So anyways, enough of this now. There'll be other opportunities to talk about this more, like Western Civ 2 next semester. Okay, we have French and British in India. That's way ahead in the future. We are talking about the 1500s, and let's forget about these East India companies and stuff of that sort. Getting ahead of the whole thing. We are still in the 1500s, and all the thing that is listed here on the slide number 17 is to 17th, 18th, and 19th century, so way ahead of time. China, right? China, Portuguese arrived in 1514 at the height of the Ming dynasty. And anyways, I don't know what else to add there. The Chinese were not much impressed with these Europeans coming in. China, throughout history, considered itself as the middle kingdom of the center of the earth. And it was a very powerful, organized, well-run state and very rich state. And they didn't really quite understand what these European merchants were doing. It seemed to them very insignificant. Anyways, Japan also opening to the West. Opening to the West is a little bit exaggerated. Japan was never an open society. Portuguese arrived in 1543, and together with the Portuguese came Spain and Portugal, being Catholic countries, of course. Catholic monks, missionaries came in, and They arrived, and Francis Xavier arrived in 1549. He had some success in converting Japanese people, but in general, not very much. And then soon there was a reaction against that. So it kind of nipped it in the butt. Pardon me. Anyways, what else we have here? Slide number 19. Americas, the West Indies, British North America, way ahead of time. 1600. Too much. Now, slide number 20. We have chronology, new arrivals on the world stage. Portuguese in India. Right. You see the years, forget about this one. British East India formed in 1600s. Dutch East India Company formed in 1602. Modern history. Put this in world history too. Dutch, we can look at the slide 21. Dutch actually started their colony in Indonesia, Batavia, what they called Batavia, when they built their colony. Anyways, but enough. 22 sugar mills in West Indies. This is 17th century French illustration showing operation of sugar mill in French West India. Let's stay to the point that sugar was extremely profitable and they required a huge amount of labor, and that's one of the reasons why the slaves were brought in. But anyways, triangular trade, that's very interesting. Is basically how the ships started circulating around the Atlantic. So from a place like France, they would go, or Holland, let's say Holland, Netherlands, they would go down south to the West Africa, where they would pick slaves. They would deliver those slaves to Brazil, for example. And then in Brazil, they would pick sugar and take it back to Netherlands. And this is often called the triangular trade, because each leg of journey, the ship is filled with different things. On the way to Africa, the ship is usually filled with guns, because that's what the Dutch, for example, love to sell in exchange for the slaves in Africa. And then across the Atlantic, the ships were filled with slaves, and then back from America into Europe, the ships were filled with sugar often, and rum as one byproduct of the sugar making process. So China, the Mughal Empire, that's really way in the future. The Qing Empire in China, and so on and so forth. I think that's about it, right? Let me see. What do we have else here? Slide 28. Focus question: how did European expansion affect both the conquered and the conquerors? Well, we talked about it. So nothing really new here. Columbian exchange is this exchange of germs, and not only germs, but for example plants and animals. Europeans brought over horses into America, and they took back, I don't know, tomatoes, potatoes, and turkeys, right? Turkeys, peanuts. So that's the exchange that actually had an impact, positive impact on both societies. People became much richer because of this exchange of plants and animals. Anyways, a new map of the world, slide number 30, with the new continent now being part of the Western Hemisphere, right? So people realized that, the world that they knew was what was the world of the Eastern Hemisphere, the world of Europe, Asia, and Africa. And to this, they added a Western Hemisphere. Slide number 31. Way ahead of time, mercantilism, capitalism, world economy, Western Civ 2. And finally, let's go once again over the summary. That's slide 32. Europeans sailed out into the world in all directions. And at the end of the 15th century, with Portugal creating an empire based on trade and Spain creating a colonial empire, Spanish empire was also based on trade as much as Portuguese. By the For some reason, it seems to me that the author of the book doesn't like Spain. Anyways, which is a big mistake. And anyways, by the end of the 18th century, European rivals had created a global trade network dominated by Western ships and Western powers. Insatiable need for labor drove for the African slave trade that devastated Africa, but European expansion dramatically affected areas across the globe. And finally, Europeans increasingly saw their culture with its religion, languages, and technology as a coherent force to be exported to all corners of the world. Well, it worked. They conquered. Cortez came to Mexico and with 400 something people conquered a society of several million. It got into their heads. It was successful. Those people were conquistadores. They were stars of the time. They did something that you only read about in books. Or as we would say today, you read about in fiction, watch about in fiction movies. Anyways, so that's about it. I also want to add a bit more about Spain, because the Mr. Spielvogel doesn't like Spain, so I need to supplement it somewhat. In particular, I want to I put this PowerPoint for you on Canvas. A couple of people: Isabel of Castilla, Queen of Castilla, which is central part of Spain, and Fernando of Aragon. Aragon is the eastern part of Spain, and they were both known as Los Reyes Católicos, or Catholic kings. Their marriage created the modern state of Spain, so that's what I would like to remember. Now, slide number 3, we have the tomb of Ferdinand Isabella in the city of Granada, which was a Muslim city and conquered by Ferdinand, Isabella y Fernando. And the reason why they did it was not out of some extraordinary religious zeal, but because there was a danger that these Muslims would ally themselves with the Ottoman Empire. There was a serious threat through the whole of Europe at the time, and therefore they wanted to prevent this. And in 1492, early in January, they marched into Granada, which is high up in the mountains in the south of Spain, and eliminated the last Muslim stronghold in the Iberian Peninsula. And they decided to be buried there. On the map number 4, you have a map of Spain. On the slide number 4, you have a map of Spain. And finally, their daughter was Juana, known as La Loca. She was a queen of Castilla after the death of her mother, Isabel, who died in 1504, all the way till she died in 1555. But she was proclaimed to have been loca, right? Crazy. And so she was kept under surveillance, under arrest. First under her father, and then under her husband Philip the Fair of Burgundy. and finally of her son Charles well, in this case he was Charles the First, the King of Spain. Anyways, she was confined in a convent in Tordesillas, and Tordesillas was a place where the Spanish and the Portuguese made an agreement on how to divide the Americas. Finally, we mentioned this in regard to the Reformation. Her sister was Catherine of Aragon, who married a scoundrel, Henry VIII, King of England. And finally, her husband, Philip the Fair, was Habsburg, Duke of Burgundy. And that's how the Habsburg dynasty, which is a dynasty from Central Europe, but came to rule over Spain. And there on slide number 10 you have the map of Burgundy, which is the ancestral territory of Duke of Burgundy, right? So anyways, Joanna had two sons, Charles and Ferdinand. Charles ruled over Spain and Ferdinand ruled over Austria. Habsburgs had possessions in Austria too. And as such, they were actually the first line of defense against the Ottoman Turks. So this rivalry between Habsburg and the Ottomans is something very important for the journeys of discovery. And finally, we have here that Charles was elected the Holy Roman Empire in 1520, while he was King of Spain. So he was known as a King of Spain, as Carlos I or Charles I. But then when he became elected the King of Holy Roman Empire, that's basically King of Germany, right? If you remember that. He was the fifth Charles as the Holy Roman Empire, so then he's known as Charles V. And that's why this confusion. You remember him, that he was the one who dealt with Martin Luther ineffectively, and he was the one who actually tried to unify Europe against this threat of the Ottoman Empire, and he had enormous influence on the conquest of the Americas. So finally we have here slide number 13. That's the palace that he built in Granada for himself. And chapter 14, you have Habsburg territories in Europe, which gives you an idea that they practically controlled half of Europe. Spain, southern Italy, Duchy of Milan, Austria, Hungary, this huge chunk of Bohemia, which is today the Czech Republic, which is a huge chunk of the core Habsburg lands where they fought the Ottomans coming in from Asia Minor. And finally the Netherlands, including Burgundy. We have Charles' enemies, which was King of France. And that has to do with that fight that I talked to you about, that, as Spanish and Portuguese were going into the Americas and then profiting from these journeys, French started to try to rob them of that profit. Finally, we have Pope Clement VII, who was not friendly to Charles V and paid dearly for it. But that's a minor point for us. And his main rival here on slide 18, Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Sultan who ruled from 1520 to 1566 and laid siege to Vienna, Habsburg imperial capital, in 1529. If Suleiman had succeeded in capturing Vienna, that would probably be the end of Europe as a Christian continent at this point. So anyways, Charles' enemy, we have here, Martin Luther and things of that sort. A couple of other slides that you have here, Luther's room and so on and so forth. So that's the stuff that we talked about before. and I don't want to dwell too much on it. Charles finally realized by 1556 that he can't unify Europe. Europe is just hopelessly divided, and retired into a monastery of San Justo in the western parts of Spain, in Estremadura, where he died 2 years later in 1558. And he was succeeded by Philip II, whose name we find in the island of the Philippines, Philip II, who ruled Spain over from 1554 to 1598, the second half of the 16th century, and was enormously successful ruler. Here you have a picture of his royal palace, Escorial, near Madrid. So that's about it, what I had for you today, and I think that's about as I have for you for this semester. For now on, we'll be getting on to the final, the essay coming up, quizzes, IDs, and so on and so forth, but I think this is our last lecture for the semester. All right. See you then. Bye.